Hello, and welcome to this year's Maynard Adams Symposium of the Carolina Public Humanities. I'm Lloyd Kramer. I'm a professor of history, and I am the director of Carolina Public Humanities. And I thank all of you for joining us for this first ever Adams Symposium on Zoom. We had to cancel the Maynard Adams Symposium last year as the COVID crisis descended on all of us, but we're expecting to continue the symposium in future years as an in-person event. And in fact, we've already made arrangements to continue next year when the philosopher Tommy Shelby will be joining us. But now, for the moment, we are using computer technology to be together, even as the pandemic still separates us physically. And the advantage of this is that we can welcome people from all over the country and in fact from all over the world. So I welcome you from wherever you may be this evening. We sponsor this symposium at Carolina Public Humanities to honor the longtime UNC philosopher E. Maynard Adams, who was the founder and early advocate for what was for many years known as the Program in the Humanities and Human Values. The program was established in 1979, and CPH now serves as a bridge between people within the university and people outside of the university, and we serve thousands of people every year. Our mission is to foster public discussion of the humanities and to connect people all around North Carolina, including teachers in K-12 education and partners at community colleges around the state. And we also serve lifelong learners in weekend seminars and book groups and many other kinds of activities. We're also committed to the themes of UNC's strategic plan for our public university. And this plan stresses that Carolina is always of the public and for the public. And to quote another theme from our university's strategic vision, we also seek to promote and support a democratic society by encouraging informed public discussion. As Maynard Adams himself always argued, we believe that the humanities are essential for the survival of democratic societies. These broad goals contribute to the themes of this year's symposium, which is entitled, "What Should the Work Ethic Mean in a 21st Century Capitalist Society?" And our goal in this symposium is to think about how meaningful work is important for both individual well-being and the health of the whole society. We want to discuss how work and the work ethic should be understood in a democratic capitalist society. And work is an essential issue for the humanities because it's one of the places in which personal lives and public issues converge for all people in different social, economic, and national communities. These issues are important for everyone. So we're very pleased to have Professor Elizabeth Anderson joining us via Zoom from the philosophy department at the University of Michigan, because she has written extensively about the nature of employer-employee relations, and she is now completing an important book on the history and current meanings of the work ethic. I'm going to say a bit more about Professor Anderson's influential writings when I introduce her, but I first want to recognize a few people who have helped to make this event possible. This symposium exists because of the generous support of Crawford Taylor and the Taylor Charitable Trust, which is based in Birmingham, Alabama. Crawford was a student of Maynard Adams back in the 1960s, and he honors Professor Adams for his influence as a teacher, as a mentor, and an advocate for philosophical ideas that can help to shape our social world. We therefore thank Crawford Taylor and other members of his family who've enabled us to create this symposium. The Taylor Charitable Trust has also given us funds to establish an interdisciplinary graduate student program called the Maynard Adams Fellowships for the Public Humanities. And each year, Carolina Public Humanities organizes a year-long seminar for 10 Adams Fellows who are chosen from various departments through a competitive application process and who have described their strong interest in connecting humanistic work with public audiences and communities outside the university. Each of the Adams Fellows also develops a public humanities project in which they foster public discussions and humanistic engagement with important public issues. This year's Adams Fellows are with us today in the giant Zoom room, and their names are listed on the agenda for the symposium. Normally, at this moment, I would ask them all to stand and receive applause for their work, but today we honor them with a virtual ovation. And maybe they're standing wherever they may be, but we appreciate what they're doing. In addition to the Taylor Charitable Trust, I want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences and Senior Associate Dean Elizabeth Engelhardt for the college's financial contribution to this symposium. And other much appreciated financial support has come from the philosophy department here at UNC. And I want particularly to thank the chair of that department, Professor Mark Lang, for the ongoing collaboration between the philosophy department and Carolina Public Humanities. I also thank everyone who supports the diverse programs of Carolina Public Humanities, and we could not flourish without our great advisory board and the board's chair, Joe Rytock, a Carolina alum from the Department of American Studies. And finally, I thank the great staff of Carolina Public Humanities for all the work they've done to organize this symposium and transform it into an unprecedented Zoom webinar. We have a great team at CPH, including those who created this event: Max Orr, Joanna Smith, Vicki Breeden, Susan Landstrom, and Paul Benici. And Paul Benici should receive particular recognition for organizing the technical infrastructure for this symposium and for all of our online events, which connect us to the whole world. So our symposium begins today with Professor Anderson's keynote talk, and it continues tomorrow morning over Zoom with a panel of UNC faculty and graduate students who will respond to the themes of today's talk. And Professor Anderson will respond to the comments of the panelists tomorrow and to additional questions from the audience. And this panel discussion begins at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning and continues until 12:15. But you will need a separate Zoom code to enter that event. If you have not yet registered for tomorrow's session, you can still do so by going to the CPH website at humanities.unc.edu. So our goal at both today's event and at our conversation tomorrow morning is to examine how ideas about work and the work ethic intersect with the humanities and with ethical issues, with democratic processes, and with daily economic life. The meaning of work continues to evolve amid our new technologies, and the COVID pandemic has pushed every institution to rethink and reorganize the ways in which it organizes the work lives of its employees. At this moment, we therefore need to think about how historical and ethical perspectives can help us reshape the meaning and practices of work in the United States. How can we address both the economic and ethical issues of work that are always part of workers' daily lives and that require cultural and political innovations? That is the organizing question for our symposium. We're honored that Chancellor Kevin Guskowitz of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has affirmed a long-term interest in the Adams Symposium since the time he was the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Chancellor Guskowitz is an advocate for the liberal arts and the humanities, and he is pursuing these interests today, in fact, on a historical tour of historical sites and museums in Alabama that provide insights and information about the history of the civil rights movement. He's making this tour with some alumni who are looking for new ways to support UNC's ongoing efforts to honestly confront our institution's history of racism and racial exclusion. These alumni also want to advance the work of the university's Special Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward, which is trying to develop new forms of institutional memory and historical reckoning. But before leaving for Alabama, Chancellor Guskowitz sent along a special welcome for today's Adams Symposium. And so now we turn briefly to Chancellor Guskowitz for his welcoming comments.
Thank you, Lloyd. Good evening and welcome to the Carolina Public Humanities 4th Annual Maynard Adams Symposium. After we had to cancel last year, it's wonderful to come together virtually for this important event in the life of our university. This symposium honors the legacy of a former chair of the philosophy department and faculty leader, E. Maynard Adams. His dream of a public humanities program was launched over 40 years ago, and we are seeing the result of this work every day here at Carolina. This symposium emphasizes the importance of the humanities for understanding and analyzing public issues, current debates, and public education. It is through the humanities that we understand ourselves and the world around us. Our students need the humanities to be fully engaged citizens and the leaders of tomorrow. The humanities give us essential knowledge and perspectives as we carry out our mission of service to the people of North Carolina and beyond. We are here today because of the dedicated work of many, and I want to thank a few of them now. Crawford Taylor and his family supports this annual event and the graduate program, the Maynard Adams Fellows for the Public Humanities. To the Taylor family, thank you for your faithful support. I also want to thank the Carolina Public Humanities who sponsor this event. Thank you, Chair of the Carolina Public Humanities Advisory Board, Joe Riddick. And thank you to the Maynard Adams Fellows for the Public Humanities for your work to advance public humanities. We are honored to have Professor Elizabeth Anderson from the University of Michigan as our keynote speaker at this symposium. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. And finally, I want to thank my good friend and colleague, Lloyd Kramer, for his incredible service to Carolina. I hope each one of you enjoy the symposium, and I will now turn it back over to Dr. Kramer to introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, Chancellor Guskowitz. I appreciate your comments and your continuing support for Carolina Public Humanities. So we turn now to our keynote speaker, Professor Elizabeth Anderson, who is the John Dewey Distinguished University Professor, the John Rawls Collegiate Professor, and the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor in the Philosophy of Department at the University of Michigan. She also used to be, in her spare time, the chair of that department, but she has now given up that particular position. You should have received some biographical information about Professor Anderson in the materials that went out to the symposium's registered participants, but I'd like to note just a few highlights of her career. She completed her BA in philosophy with a minor in economics at Swarthmore College and went on to receive a PhD in philosophy at Harvard University in 1987. She moved then to the University of Michigan, and she has taught there throughout her academic career. Professor Anderson's many publications have made her an influential philosopher in a wide range of subjects, including ethics, social and political philosophy, feminist theory, and the philosophy of economics. And she's also interested in how people make value judgments and how the emotions affect human knowledge and democratic deliberation. Her recent work has focused especially on the history of ideas about egalitarianism, which is a key element of her concerns about work. She seeks to explain the long-running debate between those who view work simply as an economic activity or a commodity-producing task, and those who see work as an essential part of the quest for human well-being, happiness, and meaning. She therefore explores questions about the nature of meaningful work. Among her many influential publications, I would especially note her book, Private Government: How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It, published in 2017 by Princeton University Press. and she has just completed a new book entitled The Great Reversal: How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers. And her talk draws on this current project, which will appear in a forthcoming book. Professor Anderson has received numerous honors, including selection as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and her work has attracted wide attention beyond the universities. Her talk today is entitled, What Should the Work Ethic Mean for Us Today? Reflections on Contemporary Capitalism. And we're very happy to welcome her to UNC through Zoom. She will be sharing her screen throughout her talk, and I should note that you may submit questions for Professor Anderson during and after her talk through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will convey questions for discussion at the end of the talk. But now I want to give a warm Carolina welcome to Professor Elizabeth Anderson. Welcome to Chapel Hill and to the Zoom world.
I'm absolutely delighted to be able to address you. Thank you, Dr. Kramer, for the invitation. I thank the Carolina Public Humanities as well. And I only wish I could be there in person to enjoy a beautiful Carolina spring. I'm going to start by having us reflect a little bit about the idea of the socially necessary worker, which arose in the context of our current pandemic. Perhaps many of you had signs like this that popped up in Harbor, thanking essential workers, the people who had to serve others face-to-face, person-to-person, healthcare workers, transportation workers, all kinds of workers in necessary retail operations such as grocery stores and so on. There was an outpouring, I think, of public support and sympathy for people who were exposing themselves to infection in order to take care of the rest of us, whereas many of us, such as academics like myself, were able to perform duties at home without having to expose ourselves. Despite that sympathy, there were several things that happened which are quite disturbing. So nurses were fired for demanding personal protection equipment, which was in shortage in many hospitals and healthcare clinics. Healthcare system administrators often resisted safety accommodations. I know this personally because my husband is a physician and he was trying to get better safety precautions at his clinic. Meatpacking workers were subject to crowding and speed up, assembly line speed up, and that led to numerous COVID-19 hotspots at the meatpacking plants. The Florida governor gave priority to his campaign contributors, essential workers such as teachers and bus drivers, in access to the vaccine earlier this year. So I think these two ideas, one reflected in the picture where we should be supporting necessary workers, and the other where they're treated rather harshly, that's really the theme of this. What is the source of these two opposing ways of thinking about work and workers? Here's one thought that comes from David Graeber, LSE anthropologist who unfortunately died very recently. He wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs. It was a critique of the work. He defined bullshit jobs as paid employment, so pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee can't justify its existence, although the employee must pretend that this is not the case. He distinguished bullshit jobs from what he called shit jobs, which are all kinds of useful but poorly paid drudgery, and claimed that various surveys in the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands found that 40% of all workers claim that their own jobs are bullshit jobs. When I taught a course on work ethic to my undergraduates, I polled them about whether they had ever worked at a bullshit job, and about 40% raised their hands. My favorite example of such a job was a student who was hired to write business reports that no one ever read. A more famous critic of the work ethic is Max Weber, who wrote the most famous book about the Protestant work ethic, called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, back in 1920. He's one of the greatest social theorists of all time. He argued that the work ethic simply rationalized the capitalist exploitation of workers' willingness to work. And he claimed that it put all of us into an iron cage. Work in a calling, but we are forced to do so. Thoughts like that led me back to the original Puritan work ethic, and in particular, the leading theorists of the work ethic, the Puritan minister Richard Baxter, who lived in the 17th century. And he outlined some basic features of the work ethic. The leading one is that everyone has to find their calling and then work in a dedicated and enthusiastic way in their calling. God calls everyone to a specialized occupation, and people should dedicate their lives to that. We shouldn't be wasting our time. We shouldn't be idle. This is an ethic of serious, disciplined work throughout our lives. We shouldn't waste anything either. God gave the earth to all of us for use in service to humanity. The work ethic is an ascetic doctrine, so we shouldn't just be indulging in worldly pleasures and vanities. We should make sure that we put everything to good use to help people, but not just to indulge in laxity and pleasure. We shouldn't be covetous. We shouldn't want more than what we need to fulfill our duties. Nevertheless, he also said that the good man will frugally getteth and saveth as much as he can. So you work hard and then you make a lot of money, you save it up, right? You have to save that money too, not spend it on luxury. And all of these elements of the work ethic were designed to give people certainty of salvation. The theory was that you couldn't know you're truly faithful except by manifesting that in your behavior. So there is justification by faith alone, but you can't look inside your head or your heart to tell whether you really have faith. The only way you can tell is by looking at your external behavior, whether you are fulfilling God's will in beings on earth, which is to work assiduously to help our fellow human beings. Now, over time, Max Weber argued that the work ethic became secularized. So the stern, old, ascetic Puritanism fell away, and the work ethic continued, but it became secularized. And basically what that means is that the goods that were promised to people in the next life now are pulled into this life, okay? So salvation promised, according to Baxter, the saints' everlasting rest. You're working really hard and hardly get any rest in this life, but in the next life, you enjoy an eternal vacation in heaven, in communion with God. So that's one example. So what I have here on this path is to show you this theological doctrine on the left-hand column and how it got secularized on the right hand. And there were two paths to secularization. One I call conservative because it was actually articulated by members of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. And then we're going to see a more progressive work ethic later on. So theologically, the work ethic asserted that you can tell from how rich people are whether God is rewarding them for their virtuous conduct performance of the work ethic on earth. And hence, the poor stand to the rich as lazy sinners stand to the hardworking. And that idea got secularized into the thought that people are entitled to honor conditional on their being sufficient, right? You have to provide for yourself and not rely on other people to provide for you. And that led to the thought that the poor are presumptively undeserving. Theologically, conservatives said that it was a bourgeois duty to maximize profits by setting your workers to work very hard and disciplining them to do so. And that idea became secularized into the ideology of shareholder capitalism, that the duty of managers of a capitalist firm is to maximize profit, and that public policy also should favor the interests of property owners or capital owners over the interests of labor. Theologically, conservatives interpreted the work ethic to mean that in order to maximize profits, you have to keep wages low. And that leads to a class of working poor. One of Puritans' favorite quotes from the Bible was that he who does not work shall not eat. They said it all the time. And so when that became secularized, it turned into a general sense that if people are poor and unable to provide for themselves, that they should rely on private charity rather than public welfare programs, or if there is a public welfare program, it should be embodied in a workfare program rather than free handouts. The conservatives also insisted that no one is entitled to unearned leisure. Rest should always follow work. And in secular terms, that led to the idea that nobody should get any vacations or leaves without having earned it through their hard work and gotten it in their employment contracts. No guaranteed vacations on this view. Theologically, work was conceived as a kind of ascetic discipline. If you set workers to work, then their minds will not be distracted by temptation. And in secular terms, that turned into what I'll call the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. That is the idea that capitalists, owners of firms, should be running the lives of their workers. Yet there was another side of the work ethic. You find this in Baxter and another wonderful Puritan minister, Robert Sanderson. Robert Sanderson wrote one of the most famous sermons ever, dedicated to instructing people how they should find their calling. And in this sermon, he said, don't think you're going to get a special revelation direct from God. Instead, you should look at your talents and what kind of job could arouse your enthusiasm. One way to think about Sanderson's sermon is he provides the foundations of modern career counseling. A beautiful thing about Puritan thought is that they could easily convert duties into rights. So if you find the right calling by consulting your talents and interests, okay, then it becomes a judgment that you make for yourself what your calling is. And so in order to fulfill your duty to work in the calling that God has called you to, you need a right to choose your own occupation for yourself based on your own interests. Puritans also stress the dignity of all workers. Even the most menial workers, they stress, do God's work. They're doing socially necessary labor. So they all have dignity and should be respected on that account. They also insisted on the importance of meaningful work, honest labor that are profitable to the Commonwealth. So the Puritans did recognize that nobody should be assigned to a bullshit job. They also insisted that employers have to treat their workers decently. Baxter warned employers that they should not rule their employees tyrannically, that they must provide their workers with safe and healthful conditions, that they pay them fair and living wages, that the poor who are unable to provide for themselves have a right to charity. And of course, Baxter also promised the saints everlasting rest, eternal leisure in heaven as the reward for labor. The Puritans also insisted that the rich have duties to work if they could support themselves simply by living off of their property income, off of rents and interests and profits. They must labor too. God has strictly commanded it to all. They also opposed business models that were based merely on wealth extraction. Baxter said, it's a prison and a constant calamity to be tied to spend one's life in doing little good at all to others, though he should grow rich by it himself. And he had particular business models in mind that he thought were exploitative and just extract from other people, rather than contributing to the social welfare. He called these business models oppressive. He said, don't tread on your brethren as stepping stones of your own advancement. Work is not there just to promote yourself. You have to be serving humanity. Don't injure your inferiors who are unable to resist. So don't take advantage of people just because they're desperate. And he used these ideas to attack monopolists and usurers who charge too much interest, hucksters of sorts who are selling goods that aren't really worth the price, and grocers. These are people who try to corner the market or enclose a lot of land and kick people off of it. He objected to landlords who unfairly evicted their tenants. Locke, who was a follower of the work ethic, argued against price discrimination against the poor and the desperate. That is, just because someone really needs something, you shouldn't charge them a higher price for it than you would charge somebody who isn't that desperate. And these thoughts that the Puritans had led to their own secularization in a pro-worker and progressive path. That was a path that was taken by certain classical liberals, Locke, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and ultimately led to social democracy. So let's see how that works. And again, I have the theological doctrine on the left and how it got secularized on the right-hand column. So theologically, workers are honored because they're following a sacred calling. They're doing God's will for human beings on earth. It's sacred. Ordinary work activity is sacred activity and should be honored. In secular terms, that converted into the idea that all workers are dignified, even those who are doing menial work, and that all are entitled to meaningful work. Theologically, we already see in Sanderson the doctrine of a right to free occupational choice, and that's carried over in the progressive path undisturbed. Theologically, Baxter insisted workers are entitled to a living wage. It's got to be frugal because everyone has to be frugal, but still a living wage. In secular terms, we have people like Adam Smith insisting that workers are entitled not just to a living wage, but to high and rising wages, wages that rise in accord with the progress of economic growth. Theologically, Baxter and other Puritans insisted that there's both a right and a duty to charity. A duty if you're rich enough to give, a right if you're too poor to fend for yourself. And in secular terms, that got converted into the idea of social insurance, universal social security. Theologically, what was promised was leisure in the next life, But when the doctrine gets secularized, we pull that leisure into this life. And that led to the idea of state-mandated maximum hours, paid vacations and leaves, which are very common in Europe today. Theologically, the work ethic presumed that workers were capable of internalizing the work ethic, adopting it for themselves. And that means that they're capable of a certain kind of self-government. Indeed, Baxter even advanced, he came as close as you could get to the doctrine of universal salvation. I think that's one of the reasons why in the United States, one of the sects that grew out of Puritanism in the United States is Unitarianism, right? Universalism really came right out of the Puritans. In secular terms, that turned into the idea that, well, if workers are perfectly capable of governing themselves, then they should be entitled to govern the workplace, either because they're self-employed, we should favor self-employment, or if they have to work in groups, some kind of workers' cooperative, where workers are own and run the enterprise that they're working within, or perhaps more weakly, but still substantially, co-determination, where workers manage the firm in conjunction with representatives of the shareholders. What about the work ethic today? One of my constant themes is that we never really leave the past behind, even though we're looking at a 17th century doctrine. It was picked up and developed by secular thinkers in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, including famous economists such as Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, the philosopher John Locke, and many others. And that tradition was carried and culminated ultimately in social democracy, which flourished in Europe for a very long time, and some of its policies still exist. But what about the United States? What does the work ethic look like in the United States? Here you can see a chart here that shows peer countries, and the United States is on the far right. The number of paid vacation and paid holidays among the rich of the world, and the number of working days, you could see the United States stands alone in being the only one of the rich countries where there is no nationally guaranteed paid vacation and paid holidays. Workers in the United States get paid vacation and paid holidays only through their employment contract. Only about half of all American workers get these benefits, whereas every other peer country, you could see a lot of days, France topping off the list with more than 30 days of paid vacation, and Austria throws in 13 holidays on top of paid vacation. In the United States also, there's been a growing gap between productivity and a typical worker's compensation. So around 1973, you could see in the post-war era, hourly compensation of ordinary workers kept pace with the growth in productivity. But starting around 1973, we see a divergence where hourly compensation stagnated even as productivity leapt ahead. And that gap was taken by capital owners and also by CEOs of major corporations. So here you can see CEO pay has galloped ahead. It was once, you can see here that before 70, CEO compensation was even below $1 million in 2018 dollars. And now, right, it's just leaped ahead. And similarly, if you judge it by the S&P 500 index, also exploded, especially since 1990. Well, one thing that could be said on behalf of the rich today is that unlike the rich in the United Kingdom of old times, tended to be landlords who just collected the rents and didn't have to do any work for it. Today, the rich aren't idle. In fact, they work a lot. CEOs work an enormous number of hours. And so on behalf of them, one might say, but look, they work longer hours. Shouldn't they get more? So we can see here for men especially, the higher their job in rank, the more overtime they work. And for women too, although at a lower rate. Work hours go up with one's rank in the firm. CEOs in particular work unbelievable hours. Somebody like Elon Musk could barely take the time to acknowledge to a reporter that he was temporarily the richest man in the world. And his response was, oh, well, back to work. I want to suggest, though, that maybe we should look more skeptically at this justification for outsized pay of CEOs, heads of firms. And my worry goes back to Baxter's worry about business models that are merely wealth extractive. Yes, many CEOs are extremely busy, but we shouldn't confuse being very busy with work that actually enhances the welfare of people other than oneself and shareholders who are simply the rentiers of the past, collecting wealth without actually doing any work. And I want to suggest to you that many business models of many capitalist firms today, certainly not all of them, there's plenty of capitalist firms that really are promoting social welfare. A number of them, including many in which enormous profits are made, are merely extracting wealth. There are many private equity firms that make profits by driving the firms they acquire into bankruptcy. These firms are called vulture capitalist firms. Just by pocketing the assets of the firm and throwing all the workers into unemployment and no longer serving the public consumers with any goods. Another type of business model is exploiting the vulnerable. So many Americans have been struck with surprise medical bills. They did all their homework and found a healthcare provider in network. And they're struck with surprise when the network invites a doctor who's out of network to maybe perform stitches on your surgery that could have been done by a resident in network, and then send you a bill for $60,000. There's all kinds of predatory credit schemes that also are designed to trap people in ever increasing debt that they can't pay off, basically just to strip them of their homes or other assets they might have. Many business models profit by misleading people about the advantages of what they're buying into. Multi-level marketing works this way. The vast majority of people who go into a multi-level marketing scheme lose investment. Recently, in the last few years, we've become aware of the proliferation of for-profit scam schools in higher education, where students pay tens of thousands of dollars for a degree that turns out to be worthless and not by employers as a real credential. Many business models simply shift risks to the vulnerable, people who can't possibly manage the risks. So we have seen wave after wave of bankrupt pensions, where the workers have worked steadily for 30 years at their job, and at the end, they don't get a pension. Some business models undermine future generations. Fossil fuels, for instance, are like that, and they're desperate to hang on to their share of the energy market. Some businesses spread hatred and propaganda. A lot of social media is like that. That ends up undermining democracy. So in that light, I think we should revisit Graeber's critique of what he called bullshit jobs, which which are pointless or pernicious jobs as viewed by the employees themselves. He complained that bullshit jobs inflict spiritual violence on people. And he proposed as an alternative that people should just be freed of all of this pointless labor or pernicious labor, cut everybody's work hours by 40%. Because the spiritual violence, though, of these jobs, he said that he complained that it's indignified, it inflicts an indignity on people to be consigned to useless or pernicious labor. It undermines their own agency. And that workers feel humiliated in being ordered to do worthless tasks just because the boss is, say, doing a power play on them just to show their power, or just in order to serve the boss's vanity. He also pointed out that one way to punish prisoners who've misbehaved is to ban them from work. Even though the prison labor might be menial, cleaning toilets in the prison, prisoners actually are very frustrated when they're just stuck watching TV rather than able to do something that's useful within the prison. I want to suggest that Graeber's notion of spiritual violence here, rather than pointing to society, as he suggested, that these complaints are actually better motivated by the progressive work ethic than by an ideal of a leisure society. What he's really saying here is that people want to be useful. They want to do good in the world, and that's an important motivation for real work. Meaningful work is what people want. And indeed, if we look at workers themselves, they hate being in bullshit jobs. They hate being in jobs that they think are pernicious. So here's an article from The Hill recently related to the 2020 election. Facebook employees wanted to continue an emergency measure that Mark Zuckerberg implemented at their request to change the news feed of Facebook users so that it would be biased in favor of reliable sources rather than sources that were spreading conspiracy theories, distrust, and division, and propaganda of various sorts. And they proposed to Zuckerberg that this jiggering of the algorithm to favor reliable, truthful news be made permanent in order to reduce the hate and partisanship that Facebook's own internal research on the effects of its newsfeed algorithm had confirmed. And Zuckerberg said, no, we're going to go back to the old one where people get conspiracy theories and propaganda, because that increased engagement, the number of minutes people spent on Facebook. At this point, I think it's worthwhile to recall John Milton, a great Puritan and contemporary of Baxter. When he wrote Paradise Lost, he imagined what he was thinking when he and Eve were expelled from the garden. And this is what he said in Paradise Lost, channeling Adam's thoughts. With labor, I must earn my bread. What harm is that? Idleness would have been worse. I can kind of relate to Milton. And so I want to conclude with some thoughts about what the work ethic should mean for us today. Another reason why I think we're not close to a leisure society is that we're facing global climate change, which is going to mean that there's plenty of meaningful work that needs to be done, both to adapt to climate emergencies and to mitigate, prevent these even worse emergencies from taking place. There's no shortage of meaningful work here to the public interest. So I think what we should be asking is not how we can ditch the work ethic, but rather we should be asking, how does work need to change so that it merits the enthusiasm that Milton's Adam towards it? Because right now we have a lot of workers, both those consigned to bullshit jobs who don't feel enthusiastic about what they're doing because they see their work as pointless or pernicious, but also workers who are doing socially necessary work, but who are treated very poorly, subject to unsafe conditions, paid badly, suffering the indignity of being called unskilled and menial. So many workers in America are suffering from all kinds of problems at work. And it's hard to gin up a lot of enthusiasm if you're subject to those kinds of conditions. I think then that our aim should be to replace oppressive and meaningless work with work that enhances all people's lives, including the lives of the workers themselves. And that we need to reward all work with respect, decent pay and decent conditions, opportunities for autonomy and leisure. And that we should empower workers with a voice within their firms that will enable this, because workers share these conditions. And whether that means co-determination or promoting workers owning their own firms, that's an interesting question. I think we should explore it. And one of the economists who has explored this is Thomas Piketty in his latest book, Capital and Ideology, who's advancing a 21st century update of social democracy. And I do think that that is a direction that we should be exploring, not to endorse everything Piketty says, but I think that is a positive direction for the future of work and hence for the work ethic in the 21st century. Thank you.
And here we are. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. I want to remind you that if you would like to ask a question, you should submit that in the Q&A function, and I will try to get to as many of them as we can. Occasionally, I'm seeing that people are raising their hand, but that won't really work. You're going to need to put your comment in the Q&A. So I'm going to begin with a question, and thank you very much for raising a whole lot of issues in a very wide-ranging historical portrait from the 17th century to today. And the first question is from one of our participants, Paul Connick. Is the work imperative unique to capitalism? Haven't socialist and fascist states similarly glorified and mandated labor, much of it what you've identified as bullshit jobs? For example, the joke in the former Soviet Union, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. It's a famous cliche, but the incentive is different, the economic betterment of the collective, or in reality, coercion. But is this unique to capitalism, the phenomenon you're describing?
Oh, not at all. So in fact, in my manuscript, you can run the work ethic straight through Marx. And if we actually have the earliest writing that was preserved of Marx was his Abitur, his high school graduation exam, in which the question that that was posed to all the students was on a young man's choice of profession. And his answer reproduced Robert Sanderson's sermon. And what I argue in my book is that Marx's ideal of unalienated labor really is just a secularized version of the Puritan work ethic. Mm-hmm. But of course, as you know, Marx's ideology got perverted into a kind of totalitarian doctrine. So if you look at the Soviet Union, right, it was all about workers, purportedly to serve all of humanity, but in a highly coercive way. Mm-hmm. And so the work ethic, of course, spread out across Europe and countries that were colonized by European countries, and could take very perverse directions.
Okay, thank you. So the work can lose meaning in any economic system very quickly. That's the problem you're
Oh, absolutely. But there's also historical continuity. That is that if you look at the communist countries of Europe, right, I mean, that in a way is a articulation of a kind of totalitarian version of the work ethic. If it's not the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, it's the dictatorship of the Communist Party.
Yeah, okay. So here's a question that kind of follows on the issue of Marx, which you just mentioned. This is from Pavel Nevchovsky. Thanks for your talk, Professor Anderson. I think the picture you painted today of the parallels between the religious and secular views of work is very plausible. However, I'm interested in where Marxist thought, and more generally far left thought, which I see as a critique of both the religious and the bourgeois views on labor and work, fits into the picture. Did nearly 2 centuries of Marxism make any dent in the US zeitgeist? And do you see any hope for the future? Those are 2 different questions, I guess. Did it make a historical difference?
So
And what about the future?
We should So I do think Graeber is not a Marxist. Actually, it comes from an anarchist, right? And anarchists thought that people would spontaneously want to work as needed to help their fellow human beings. Mm-hmm. And in a way, you could see some aspects of Marx's ideal of unalienated labor trending in that direction. Mm-hmm. Many people have thought, I think, that he was too optimistic about this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That you can't completely disconnect material rewards from dedicated so we can see these influences traced through the left as well. But the utopian socialists also thought, you make work meaningful and then we could all share alike. But utopian socialist schemes, which flourished in the United States in the 19th century, they almost all of them failed. The only surviving cases are actually the Shakers. Mm-hmm. They retained a religious foundation.
So what you're describing as meaningful work could be compared to the notion of unalienated labor. That is, labor that doesn't feel separated from what's most important about your own selfhood or your meaningful activity.
Yes, so encapsulated simply this more uplifting version of the work ethic, which you can find in Sanderson. Mm-hmm. He thinks that to find your calling is to find a mode of work in which you serve, in the process of serving humanity, you fulfill yourself because you can take pleasure and fulfillment in the exercise of your own talents. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially Marx's ideal of unalienated labor, right? That you develop and exercise your own talents in a multidimensional way. And because you take pleasure in that, right, when you dedicate the exercise of your talents to help people, right, mm-hmm. and then get appreciated for that work by the people who are helped, that work becomes its own reward. And I think that would be the ideal, right? And many people do find that work is their own reward, but they still want to be paid for it. Right?
Well, ideally, like a good teacher gets that feeling, yes. Right? You're a teacher.
Oh, absolutely.
It carries its own rewards, and that's what you're saying. All work should have some component of carrying its own reward.
Yeah.
And also be paid well.
Yeah.
Okay, so this leads us to another question. Our colleague Doug McLean has asked, what are your reactions to the recent defeat of a movement to unionize Amazon workers in Alabama? So this carries us from the 17th century to last week's newspapers. Does this suggest that workers themselves are skeptical about meaningful work, or what do you make of that?
I think actually that they were afraid and intimidated. So labor law does prohibit things like threatening to fire workers if they unionized. That's illegal, but it happens all the time. Mm-hmm. And a very high percentage of union drives inculcate leaders, if not through direct threats, then through veiled threats of various sorts. And also there's so little of a labor movement these days that it's hard for workers to grasp the upside of unionization. It was a
Mhm.
lot easier back in the day when about a third of American workers were unionized. But basically, this is a feature of the way American labor law works. In other countries, there are higher rates of unionization, particularly in Scandinavia, that deliver visible benefits to workers. But this is fundamentally a product of how labor law works. In Scandinavian countries, you have sectoral bargaining. And what that means is that an individual firm cannot really gain by keeping a labor union out and then driving wages down to get a competitive advantage, because in sectoral bargaining, like all the workers are covered in that industry. And so then they don't really have as much of an interest in unionization. Whereas in the American system, where you have to unionize plant by plant and workshop by workshop, any given employer feels that they thereby become at a competitive advantage relative to competitors who don't have a unionized workforce. So they just resist it to the hilt.
So this is once again an example of how history is all around us. There's a history in Europe, for example, that differs and creates a different culture of labor and labor unions. So
yes,
I'm a historian, so I'm always giving a shout out to history. So good point, I think. So I want to move on to another question. This is from Mina Fuad, who says, can you give some examples of bullshit jobs? What would fall into that category? I guess in the United States, for example. What would the alternatives to those jobs be? A social welfare program that ensures people don't fall below an established quality of living despite working less, or does it not necessarily mean that? I mean, could you still do bad jobs but get at least a fair wage and meaningful benefits, for example?
Yeah, so Graeber distinguishes what he calls bullshit jobs from what he calls shit jobs, which is basically menial labor. Still, everyone understands it's socially necessary. Somebody has to clean the toilets. Okay, it's not paid well, it's not treated with dignity, but everyone understands that that kind of work has to be done. The bedpans of hospital patients have to be emptied and so forth. And everyone understands that those kinds of jobs have to be done. And so the argument there is, well, pay them decently. People should not have to labor in poverty. And indeed, the United States is off the charts relative to peer countries, equally wealthy countries, in the percentage of workers who, even though are still in poverty. Bullshit jobs are different because those, as Graeber points out, tend to be actually middle class or even upper class jobs. And so I think the best example I can think of is predatory private equity. You have these people who make millions of dollars simply by stripping the assets from the firms that they have acquired and throwing people into unemployment. And maybe tomorrow I could explain to you how this works and how people can profit by throwing companies in bankruptcy that they have acquired. But yes, this is possible. So they're actually engaged in pernicious labor. Probably most of the private equity managers don't care because they just want the money. But a lot of the people working for firms like that, maybe just as secretaries or something, once they catch wind of what they're doing, recognize that, right, that they're part of a firm that is predatory.
So that makes you feel kind of bad if you're interested in meaningful work, I should think, right?
Yes,
so.
And that's why I highlighted. That's why I highlighted those Facebook workers.
There is meaningless work in almost every line of work, including academics, I would say. But yes,
yes, I mean, there is that too. So in fact, one of my students reported she had first gotten a summer job working at a lab, actually doing experiments, and found that very exciting and fulfilling. But then next summer, the scientists wanted to hire her back and made her into a supervisor of the lab workers, but she had no work to do because the lab workers were totally self-sufficient and knew everything. And so she's just idle, right? She actually had better pay, see her title, but she felt useless. and was
Yeah.
bored and felt kind of guilty taking the money. But it had been written into the grant, and the scientist hadn't really thought through what duties she could be given. So that would be another example of a job that's not pernicious, but it is kind of pointless.
That's kind of pointless. Yeah.
And she's the indignity of uselessness.
Okay, let's go on to another question. Meaningful work as a goal could be a challenge due to increased sophistication of skills needed, for example, computers. Is it still possible to match meaningful work with all kinds of new technologies?
You know, many people in tech think that jobs are going to be eliminated. I'm not so convinced by that. I think there's always going to be a demand, especially for services from real human beings. If you've ever dialed up to get customer service and you're being served by a bot, or even just by a very long menu, when you know that the bot cannot handle your problem, you really need to speak to a human being who has flexibility, right? We should be investing more in workers who can actually have the flexibility to handle our problems, whatever it might be with customer service. And there are many other jobs like this. I think home healthcare, for instance, the Japanese are banking on robots because they don't want to bring in immigrants. But I think a lot of elderly people maybe would feel awfully lonely if they only have robots taking care of them.
They would rather interact with a human being, and it could be a meaningful work, especially if those workers were paid well and fairly. I think that's your point.
Yeah.
That the work itself could be meaningful. So here's another question about the nature of work guarantees. Do you think there needs to be a greater use of an industrial policy and a job guarantee in order to facilitate meaningful work? Should everybody have the right to a job?
Well, I do think that we should run our policies so as to promote full employment. Now, economists do worry about an absolute job guarantee. There are economic reasons for worrying about that. What about people who just refuse to really work honestly? Right, you have to be able to fire them.
Yeah.
And there are other issues that arise. There's a theory known as efficiency wages. In order to get the best work out of people, you actually have to pay them a little bit above the market clearing rate. So there's going to be a little bit of unemployment, and it's not necessarily bad as long as the unemployment is temporary. Right? You could tide people over. But it's actually remarkably difficult to have a literally full employment economy at decent wages with everybody working up to snuff.
And some people may actually not want to work for whatever reason. I guess that is a question. Maybe they haven't read their Protestant work ethic sources, and they don't understand that work, idleness is the devil's workshop. There are all these cliches we learn, right?
Well, we should also consider, though, and this is very important, and that is that there's plenty of hard work that needs to be done that is paid for a wage.
Yeah.
Raising your own kids.
Yeah.
And Richard Baxter, basically, he said women fulfill the work ethic by raising their own kids, even though they're not paid for it. Right. And that's honest labor.
Yeah, and paying people to raise children. I mean, there's sort of the idea of providing supplements for families with young children, to help them. That's serious work that needs to be compensated. So here's another question about unionization. Maybe you've already addressed this. What can be done to when workers oppose unionization, if they themselves make that decision? So if workers don't want to unionize, you're saying unionization would enhance meaningful work, or at least meaningful wages for many people. But what if workers absolutely don't want to be unionized? I think that's the question.
I don't think it's so obvious, when workers turn down a union, virtually always it's because they've been intimidated and frightened. And there's a lot of propaganda that they're told, which is which is, but there's also a lot of lost knowledge from the fact that we have such low rates of unionization. But I'm pretty much a fan of co-determination, which is a somewhat different system. And in that system, workers are guaranteed under the basically charter of the corporation to have seats on the board of directors, and also they have works councils where they can bring concerns about the shop floor, the day-to-day conditions of work, to the works council, and then work things out with management. And that's been a very successful model in Germany and other European countries. And indeed, I was talking a few months ago to an engineer who was an American engineer, but he is married to, his wife is from Germany. And so they picked up and moved to Germany for a while. He was working at a German engineering firm with co-determination. And he was just marveled at how much more respect the engineers got because there was co-determination and works councils than what engineers get in the United States. And if you look, for instance, at the source of the Boeing MAX crashes, I followed this story very closely. And one thing that was remarkable was that the engineers themselves knew that the product that they were designing, this aircraft, had serious flaws in it. Kept on sending messages up to the executive saying, no, we have to correct these problems. And the executive said, just follow orders. We have to meet deadlines, production deadlines. Right. And they were extremely upset that they were being pushed to work too fast, that there were flaws in the design of the plane. And had they slowed down, right, the engineers wanted to do a good job. And they were prevented from doing so. And ultimately, leading to a catastrophe, not only for the passengers who died in the Boeing MAX, but also just did grievous damage to Boeing's reputation. It's not even clear whether they'll be able to survive it in the civilian aircraft market.
So this is where ethical issues can never ultimately be separated from the economic issues. You're saying if people ignore these kinds of ethical questions, it can have all kinds of ramifications that go far beyond ethical or moral judgments. Because they're all connected. Absolutely.
I mean, most workers do not want to work for a firm that is predatory like that.
They're doing it.
But the thing is that we've empowered a class of capitalists, which again, it's not all CEOs. Many of them are very conscientious and want to do a good job. But some of them really just, they're in there, CEOs are in there for 4 years. They want to maximize profits and get out. They don't really care so much what happens after they're gone.
Yeah. Okay, let's go on to another question. This is from our friend John Lafferty. In many cases, he says, the bullshit job is only part of the job. How do we deal with an overall satisfactory job that has serious issues within that job? In other words, many jobs have bullshit components.
Right, and Graeber points that out. I really think that co-determination would help. If workers had a guaranteed voice, they don't like to be bored, right? Right, and you can redivide the labor in more interesting ways, and perhaps even give the workers more leisure. It's unbelievable how many hours American workers work, even to exhaustion. And if you read Adam Smith carefully, he complained about this. He said, look, the employers constantly think that if you just make workers work longer hours, that you'll get more production. And he said, not necessarily. Their work to exhaustion. And then in the middle of the week, they're so tired, they can't be that productive. And there's higher rates of workplace injuries and so forth. If you slow down and give them some rest, you can actually get more productivity out of them. And indeed, if you look at France, which famously has short work weeks, productivity per hour is higher than American worker productivity per hour because they have their leisure.
Well,
they get recharged.
This was part of the logic of like creating the 40-hour work week in France during the Popular Front, for example. The argument was you would actually get more efficient and effective work if you reduce the hours of work. Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's a question from Luc Bovens, one of our philosophers, who says the utopian socialist in France at the beginning of the 19th century found biblical inspiration in pushing for equality of opportunity to wrest power from nobility and for collective ownership of goods. Is there any analog in the progressive religious line leading to the social welfare state you're exploring? In other words, you talk a lot about the religious elements and the origin of the work ethic. Is there a strong religious element today in the movement for meaningful work in the social welfare state?
Well, there are some, notably progressive denominations, Unitarians, Quakers. Quakers were right there in the 17th century. And some Presbyterian groups that are also notably progressive and working on these issues. And of course, the Catholic tradition, which is somewhat different, has long stressed from the 19th century on the dignity of ordinary workers. It's an important part of Catholic doctrine.
Yeah. So the idea of honorable and meaningful work is important in Catholicism as well as in some of the Protestant sects you described. We didn't really talk about Catholicism so much because the work ethic is usually linked to Protestantism, right? But
that's right, yes. But in fact, there was, and various scholars have contacted me and who are working on the origins of in Catholic countries like Italy.
Yeah.
Of a version of the work ethic that was being worked out in Catholic terms.
Okay, well, we continue to get questions here, so I'm going to keep moving through as many as we can get. This is how a dialogue works in Zoom. In a big room, you'd be getting people jumping up all over the room, but here we go. This is from Joshua Kissel. He says, how does this conception of a progressive work ethic recognize the value of leisure and pleasure? This seems like it's a point a little hard to see in the secularization in the progressive direction. How do you get to leisure on the progressive side? And if it doesn't recognize this value, what warrants higher wages? Why isn't it enough to sustain sufficient if work, well, this is a little confusing to me about, is it enough to say the work is sufficient, or do we need leisure also as part of the discussion?
Yes, so in my manuscript, one of the things I argue is that what secularization does is pull goods promised in the next life into this life, right? Or it just kind of cancels things like asceticism or covetousness, actually. And what I argue is in the contest in the history of political economy between the conservative and the progressive views, and I understand that those labels are somewhat anachronistic, but they help fix our ideas, 21st century people's ideas. What advocates of the secularized conservative work ethic said was you work hard to get luxury. So they toss the ascetic element consumption side, but not on the work side. Right, you still nose the grindstone, but then you'll make a lot of money. You can enjoy luxury. Whereas if you look in the tradition of social democracy, which is a sort of...
Hello? Are you momentarily frozen? I'm not quite sure how we bring you back. This is some, I was just saying there are opportunities.
And John Stuart Mill, in his Principles of Political Economy, is right there arguing that we should go for leisure, not for luxury.
Yeah. So leisure is part of what you're calling the progressive view of work, but it's it may be something that could be developed further if we think of work going forward. Would you say that we could even get more?
Look, the United States is way behind, Europe in guaranteeing paid vacations and paid holidays, right? That's been standard issue. France was really the first to do this in the 1930s. It was wildly successful and popular.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that mandated vacations is something that no regime in France has ever tried to roll back.
The French really know how to enjoy their leisure.
They do. So here's another question. This is from Tom Doherty. If worker pay isn't increasing with productivity, and you showed us that chart, then that seems contrary to microeconomic models, according to which workers are paid the marginal product of their labor. If that's right, why do the models fail, and what would be a more accurate model? This is a...
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, every economist knows that workers are not paid their marginal products. And because the theory just doesn't really predict, observation. And one of the things we should keep in mind is that marginal products are not observable. And so managers don't know marginal products any more than economists do. And in fact, the core intuition, which explains why it doesn't even make sense to speak of marginal products, was actually articulated by Robert Sanderson. And he compared the division of labor to the mechanism of a clock. And he said, look, in a clock's mechanism, every gear and pulley and so forth plays an essential role. Even the tiniest is needed to advance the mechanism. Now, can you attribute a particular advance of the hands of a clock to any particular gear in the mechanism? Of course not. It's all of us working together. And it was that thought that you really isolate the specific contribution of any particular worker, because we're all working together, and our productivity is a function of the whole division of labor and how every worker is interacting and cooperating with the others. That's the source. And indeed, like reflections on the division of labor and how getting that right is the source of the immense increase in productivity we find right in Adam Smith and his reflections on the pin factory and the division of labor in the pin factory. That's the source of our immense productivity. It's the coordination of labor and how it's organized. It's not like the particular action of any particular worker.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And that shows how collaboration and partnership is the key to not only meaningful work, but also productive work, because isolated workers are not going to get nearly as much done.
Yeah,
that's an interesting problem, now in the age of the pandemic when people are more isolated. And anyway, these are interesting problems to think about. We have so many questions. I don't know that we can get through all of these, but I want to keep going through a few more. This is from, and we've gotten several more about Amazon, and I'm going to kind of pass over more questions on Amazon because I think we've kind of worked through that, but I appreciate that that's something people are concerned about. But here's a more general question. How has organized labor affected the work ethic since 1935, when the Wagner Act was enacted and gave union power to organize and bargain collectively? Has that affected, does organized labor challenge the work ethic that you've described, either side of it?
Well, one of the sources of complaint against unions is a practice of feather bedding. and that actually did become a serious problem in American auto factories. But in fact, feather bedding is a kind of holdover from the Great Depression. Really what it was, when you had high unemployment, you wanted to share the jobs around. Right? Everybody would do less. But then everyone would get a share of work so they wouldn't be unemployed. And indeed, if you workers' cooperatives, this is what they prefer to do. Rather than firing a whole bunch of workers who become unemployed, and then keeping the remaining workers at their existing wage. And workers' cooperatives, what they do is everybody accepts a pay cut, and then they share the work around. So everybody's doing less work, but everyone has a job.
Yeah. So in that sense, unions may have protected employment sometimes, even at the expense of wages, so that there could be a better distribution.
Yeah, I think feather bedding was just a holdover from the Depression.
Yeah.
Probably shouldn't have continued, right? But all societies and all groups are subject to cultural lags of that sort.
So here's a question from Ann Ferguson. If Marx is correct that in a capitalist system, capitalists will never allow workers to control work or the distribution of profits, what is the point of demanding that we aim to replace oppressive, meaningless work with self-enhancing, democratically controlled by workers' work, unless this means the overthrow of capitalism or something more like a market socialist model? In other words, does the structure remain the same even if you change some of the democratic control by workers?
So I mean, really, what I advocate isn't, I do think we have to update the social democratic agenda for the 21st century. But social democracy, made peace with markets. And what we discovered from the failures of comprehensive centralized planning is that it doesn't work very well. So we need markets. And, and really the focus should be on how the corporation is governed. And rather than on attacking markets. I mean, you do have to have the rule right so that people can't profit just by, stripping companies of their assets and so forth. But I don't think the source of these problems is markets as such. It has to do with actually the governance of firms, the internal government of firms.
So the question is the management and regulation of the market, not the abolition of the market itself. And that's really
but also the how we legally organize the government of the firm, right? Which is a separate issue, even from markets.
So if it's okay, we might continue just for a few more minutes. Is that okay?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, because in the spirit of a philosophical dialogue, there's never a final end to the questions. We just keep going. But don't worry. But as a society, this is from Susan Bickford, how can we fairly distribute the shit jobs? In other words, how do we make sure that they're distributed in a way that doesn't put them all on the people who are most vulnerable already? I guess that would be another way to put it, I suppose.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question how we can reorganize the division of labor. And, if you read John Stuart Mill, who was a great advocate of workers' cooperatives, his idea was, look, I mean, there is, industrial labor in the 19th century involved a lot of drudgery of manual labor. But he thought one thing that could be done is if the workers collectively govern the firm, then they're exercising cognitive skills and autonomy and so forth, and democratic skills and so forth. So they do get to exercise other skills. But then we also have the example of the famous Volvo Corporation, which decided that instead of dividing the labor so that, a worker on the auto assembly is just perpetually, doing the same task over and over again, you can have a team of workers assigned to move along the assembly line. And so to collectively, like 8 workers or something, would produce an entire car. And that would be, then they're using a variety of skills and in a variety of tasks. And it's way more interesting for them. And then they can feel satisfaction that they produced a whole product and not just like done one micro task, right? And that actually did help retain workers' interest in car assembly. There's all kinds of creative ways that we could redivide the labor so that it's more meaningful for people.
And this is one of the ways of getting beyond the alienation of labor that you described, is a sense of having a shared role in the final outcome. I wanted to ask one question related to this. It's a more educational question. is it a demand for vocational education or job training, even in higher education, as opposed to, say, the humanities and the liberal arts? Isn't that kind of the same dichotomy you're describing? That is, if people say education is just about getting a very specific task-oriented skill versus the idea of preparation for a meaningful life for the rest of your life. Do you see a parallel
yes,
between vocational education and liberal arts education, if I may put it that way?
So, yeah, I do want to point out that even humanists are needed by corporations. So I want to make my pitch for the humanities. The idea that one has to be narrowly trained with some very specific skill set is actually not what we need. Okay, because most job training happens on the job. And what you need is literate workers who are flexible, can think on their feet. My brother-in-law, this is my husband's brother, big time high-tech executive. He was working at Microsoft, a vice president of large international accounts. So he's like very high up there. And then he moved over to Amazon. But I asked him a few years ago, what are the qualities that at the time he was at Microsoft that Microsoft is looking for in entry-level employees? Is it like, do you have to, be a good coder? And he says, oh, coding? He says, no, coding skills are a dime a dozen. That's not critical. He says, by far the most important skill you need is effective communication skills. Can you convey your ideas in a way that other people in your work team can understand? Can you effectively discuss and reach a convergence on what everybody in the team needs to do to make the project a success? Can you write coherently? And I was thinking, well, these are the skills that we teach as humanists. Right? The humanities really play a role. And anyone who's opened a technical manual trying to figure out some obscure function in software and finds that it's so poorly written that they can't understand it. If they had a humanist who really knew how to write, you'd get better
maybe
help on your software.
Meaningful work that has a good outcome too. So I'm going to just, we have a lot of questions, and I'm going to ask our friend Paul Bonici to make sure we save these, because we may come back to some of them tomorrow.
Could you send them to me?
Yeah, as we want to, because a lot of people want to get in, and we're going to have more time tomorrow. But let me just ask 2 or 3 more, and then we're going to wrap it up for this evening. We usually have a long reception after these events where everyone drinks wine and continues the conversation, but we have to adapt. So here's a question from Helen Warren. How can your alternatives gain traction over the current strategies to deal with alienation, which pose employment or work as a site for romance, drama, and tragedy? That is, work itself is seen as, this very romantic way of living, right? We sort of idealize work. Many people do.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. Americans are very dedicated to work in general. Right. I think we carried over the work ethic more rigorously than other rich countries, except Japan, which had its own version of the work ethic. And some of the Japanese work so hard, they literally work themselves to death. And there's even a category in Japanese mortality tables for workers who have literally worked themselves to death. So it's only in the West, right, that there's this work ethic, although it has different origins in Japan. So I don't want to say that work is everything in life, but I do think that most people want to make a positive difference. And that is a source of meaning. When they know that their life has significance beyond just, being able to feed themselves and their family. And work can provide that. And workers, though, are frustrated that, if they're in a meaningless job, right, or a pernicious job, right, that they are deprived of that. And I think that's a real problem.
Well, and academics might have the luxury often of being able to work many hours because they find it meaningful,
Yeah, well, radical, and it's like writing utopia. I'm writing all the time. But of course,
Yeah.
I do have to say that academics, if you look at workplace satisfaction, academics are off the charts satisfied, because teaching is incredibly fulfilling and research is incredibly interesting and exciting. We have enormous autonomy in our jobs, deciding how to teach, the material and what to teach and so forth, and what to do research on. So, academics are, especially tenured academics, I'm not speaking of the people who are paid a couple $1,000s per course, because they're just part of the academic precariat in a very precarious situation. But tenured academics have probably the best wage work of any salaried workers out there. But professionals in general tend to have pretty interesting jobs with more autonomy than most.
So they don't feel their work to be as meaningless as many people are facing it. So I'm going to just pose one more question, and then we're going to adjourn for tonight. But this is from Ann Cudd, and it says, "Thanks for your talk." That's why I wanted to bring this one in, Professor Anderson. What is the role of management, if any, in the work ethic that both serves humanity and organizes meaningful work of the sort you described? Can management play a role, even apart from all of these other changes you've described, to make work more meaningful to people right now?
Well, co-determination does involve managers, but half the managers are coming from the workers themselves, and half are, representatives of the shareholders, essentially, and they collaborate. And if you ask American workers what they want, one of the reasons why they're resistant to labor unions, they feel that creates an inherently antagonistic relation to their employer, and they want a more cooperative model.
Right.
But they still want a voice, and co-determination gives that. So I'm not going, in any large scale firm, you can't run everything with participatory democracy. There's going to have to be decisions made. And if everybody makes them, then nobody makes them. And, and Anne knows that because, she's been in upper management as a dean. I was chair of my department, and I'll tell you, sometimes you just got to make decisions, right?
And you can't consult. Right.
You can't consult about every last thing, and basically, you don't want to waste your colleagues' time with all of the, diddly decisions that have to be made to run the department. So you just go ahead and decide.
I get it. I understand, even though sometimes those may not be popular decisions, but there can be greater or lesser levels of engagement and collaboration. And probably the happiest communities have some balance between a totally top-down model and one in which nothing ever gets decided without endless discussion and collaboration. Somewhere there's the golden mean. Can I use that Greek expression at this point? So thank you so much. We have a long list of other comments and questions, and we may come back to some of these tomorrow. I want to encourage everyone who's still in the room, if you haven't signed up for tomorrow's session, we're going to continue the discussion, and we'll have some panelists who will add their perspectives. I also want to mention that Carolina Public Humanities continues to have other events, and we're having a series of events on slavery in North Carolina, beginning on April the 21st, a program called I Shall Tell the Truth, a two-part webinar on the extraordinary life of Moses Roper, an enslaved man who escaped slavery and became an advocate for abolition of slavery. And our emeritus colleague, William Andrews, will be speaking about that. I just wanted to put that out there because the issue of slavery is another issue we haven't talked about, but it has another relation to labor. But Elizabeth Anderson, thank you so much. I would love it now if we could go out in the foyer of our building and all have some wine.
I know, I would love that too.
This is what the humanities are ultimately all about. But thank you for provoking us and helping us think about these issues and the ethics of work. And we'll all take a little time off tonight for leisure and resume in the morning, okay? At 10 a.m.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
And if
Yeah.
people have not registered, you can register now by going to humanities.unc.edu. And you're all welcome to continue the discussion. Thank you so much. And I'll see you
Thank
tomorrow.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.